I said over my dead body, I have banned all the export of unprocessed minerals from here. Let them stay in the ground. When the grandchildren come, they will get them out.
A political earthquake just shook the heart of Africa. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni has drawn a red line the West never saw coming. He declared, and I quote, "Minerals will no longer be exported to the West. They will only leave Uganda over my dead body." Let that sink in. This is more than just a statement. It's a declaration of economic war, a bold move to protect Uganda's resources from exploitation. And once again, it sends a clear message. Africa is done being the world's raw material warehouse. But what does this mean for Western corporations, for Africa's sovereignty? And most importantly, is this the start of a continental revolution? Stay tuned, because in this video we break down exactly what Museveni said, why it matters, and how it fits into the growing wave of African resistance against neo-colonialism. Let's begin. This is not just about Uganda. It's about the future of Africa. No to low-cost access to resources in Africa. The African continent has been providing the West with inexpensive raw resources for far too long. These resources have been exploited by the US, France, the UK, Australia, and Germany to develop and industrialize their nations. African nations, on the other hand, have remained undeveloped and unproductive, reaping little to no benefits from their wealth of resources. African leaders, such as Uganda's President Museveni, have finally made the decision to firmly oppose the unrelenting exploitation of their continent's resources. You see, outsiders, particularly those from the West and even China, would start courting the African president of that country in the same way that a man would court a woman whenever it was announced that a certain mineral had been discovered there. They would appear superior to the African leader, wearing suits and exuding confidence. They would then make a proposal and convince the African nation that it would be advantageous. For these individuals, providing the technical know-how and funding the majority of the project should be sufficient. The country as a whole would receive peanuts in the form of royalty in exchange, and the African leader would receive a portion. These individuals would claim that their investment would draw in more investors, create jobs, and improve the economy as a whole. However, examine the mining industries in each African nation. It's clear from the reports. In addition, the mining sector has underperformed, and African nations receive a meager royalty in comparison to the millions of dollars the businesses would earn. Although several nations claim that their mining industries boost their economies, the truth is often different. Consider Nigeria. Only a small number of people have profited from Nigeria's decades-long crude oil exploration. By a few people, we mean dishonest government officials, regional oil distributors, and international oil corporations. As of right now, the nation lacks a working public refinery of its own where oil can be refined domestically. The nation can only now claim to have a working refinery because its wealthiest man, Dangote, chose to construct his own private refinery. Even nevertheless, the people who have profited from this crooked system have prevented the private refinery from operating to its full potential. The president of Uganda has refused because of this. The president of Uganda claims that certain foreigners met with him to discuss the prospect of investigating Uganda's enormous iron ore resource. As you can see, Uganda's soil contains millions of metric tons of high-grade iron ore. This has the power to change the nation if applied correctly. Nevertheless, these foreigners arrived with their standard proposal to mine for iron ore and transport it to their nation for processing into final goods. The Ugandan populace would then purchase these completed goods. In Africa, mineral exploration has always been conducted in this manner. Before you knew it, more Africans would possess the necessary skills to turn these resources into final products. Not only would Africans be able to purchase these goods at a reasonable price, but the government or affluent private citizens could use the money to build factories to refine the minerals, creating jobs and putting the nation on the path to industrialization. Why hasn't this occurred is the query. Does this mean that no African leader has ever considered it? There's a good chance that an African leader has made this a requirement for international investors. In actuality, though, foreign investors would be hesitant to do this since they would not be able to generate the kind of enormous profits they are used to. For example, the export of lithium was prohibited in Zimbabwe. This was done to reduce excessive lithium smuggling, improve value addition and benefits, and provide substantial investment prospects in manufacturing and processing companies. Beyond the prohibition, however, the Zimbabwean government also looked into the potential of forming a joint venture with a Chinese business to establish a battery metals production facility in Zimbabwe. This occurred in 2024, and it is still unclear if the deal will be completed. However, we would have witnessed how quickly the Chinese would begin to exploit it if the Zimbabwean government had permitted them to explore its lithium. African leaders must therefore protect their nations. President Museveni made a startling statement if you pay close attention to the video.
Some people wanted us to export. We have got very good iron ore here. The best in the world, high grade, 70% pure. It's the best. There's no, only the one of Peru is near, about 50%, but ours is much higher. So some people wanted us to export iron ore or butare, we call it in our language, to India. And one of our districts, where some people who are here, whom I see come from, had already made a deal with India that we sell our iron ore to them as iron ore. I said over my dead body, I have banned all the export of unprocessed minerals from here. Let them stay in the ground. When the grandchildren come, they will get them out.
This is significant. First of all, these individuals traveled to Uganda with the belief that the country would sell them iron ore. They believe that Uganda is extremely impoverished and that the president is a weak and avaricious leader who would not think twice about selling its riches at a discount. For this reason, even before traveling to Uganda, they boldly struck a deal with India. This has always been the case, which is why they were able to accomplish it. As long as money is involved or they stand to gain personally, the majority of African leaders have always sold their minerals without hesitation. However, these folks had the shock of their lives. Over his lifeless body, President Museveni declared and reiterated his intention to stop exporting any raw minerals that have not been processed. However, he also made a statement that we would like to highlight.
Let them stay in the ground. When the grandchildren come, they will get them out.
He advised leaving the minerals in the ground so that our grandchildren might choose to dig them out when they arrived. This is a powerful statement. Consider it. Most of the current generation of African politicians and leaders are elderly, if you look closely at them. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. In certain nations, the same generation of leaders who have held power since independence continue to do so now. Among them is President Museveni himself. He is among Africa's longest-serving leaders. The same beliefs and ideals that have not helped the continent have guided the rule of these politicians. They still adhere to the same framework that the colonial overlords established. African nations continue to supply the rest of the world with raw minerals because to these arrangements. These mechanisms make sure Africa doesn't grow too much. Although some people may not accept this, even Western analysts have confirmed it to be true. In 2024, a French academic disclosed certain facts concerning the true cause of Africa's current state to Western media. Nobody cares too much about Africa's development, he claimed. The fact that a French professor would say this on public television indicates that he has given it significant thought, and we concur with his conclusions. The professor claims that there would be an issue if Africa developed similarly to the West. Imagine if South Korea, a nation as impoverished as Mozambique, had grown its industry similarly to Africa. What do you think would happen if Africa began producing automobiles, refining its oil, and increasing its agricultural output tomorrow? First of all, Africa's industrial demands would no longer be met by the West. Africa would therefore stop purchasing finished goods from the West. You know, Africa has a wealth of mineral and natural resources, unlike the West. The West typically needs to rely on Africa for raw materials to make its final goods. In order to produce its goods, which it currently sells to Africans, the West must import raw materials from Africa. Imagine now that the continent has reached the level of the West. Imagine that African nations now had the financial and technical resources necessary to establish industries and produce final goods like computers, phones, automobiles, and farm equipment. Africa won't have to import completed things from the West if this occurs. Furthermore, Africa does not require the importation of raw resources from the West because it possesses its own raw materials. The West would still have to import raw materials from Africa in the interim. That's not all, though. African nations are currently unable to control the price at which goods are sold because Africa supplies the West with raw materials. These nations are susceptible to price fluctuations, outside shocks, and the actions of powerful economies like the US, China, and the EU. African nations would be able to set the price of their natural resources, nevertheless, if they were to develop. They will no longer sell their minerals for extremely low prices or at a price set by the West. You can clearly see how the West would find this problematic. For this reason, the West established a structure prior to African independence that would guarantee these newly formed nations would only ever serve as raw material suppliers and never advance. It is a colonial-era system that has been adopted. These structures were only imposed by the West after independence, making it challenging to escape. An African leader can only govern in peace for an extended period of time when he supports the West. This demonstrates how the West has long maintained and dominated Africa and its leaders. However, these leaders are weak, and the only person who might topple this system would be a young leader who is not from that generation of leaders. Leaders such as Burkina Faso President Traore. President Museveni stated, "Our grandchildren," without even referring to his next generation, because he is aware of this. Young, capable leaders who can advance the continent are what African nations now need. Although the West has established a robust system to maintain Africa's underdevelopment and status as a raw material provider, we think that African nations can overcome this system and achieve independence with a strong, patriotic leader. Consider Burkina Faso, for example. There was no gold refinery in the nation prior to Traore. After being extracted from the earth, gold is shipped abroad and refined at foreign facilities. To alter the situation, Traore chose to take a different approach. He has ordered the construction of a waste processing plant and a gold refinery. The nation announced a few months ago that it had begun manufacturing its own gold bars. This is the start of industrialization. The road to industrialization would start if each African nation could take the initiative and begin turning its minerals into a final product domestically. The amazing thing is that African nations have never had a better opportunity to begin industrialization than now. The fact that Africa might position itself to replace China is one of the many things that President Trump's tariff fight with China has revealed. You know, due to low labor costs, the majority of American businesses establish their production facilities in China. Every major American company, including those in technology and textiles, has factories in China. However, these businesses are now looking for an option outside of China due to Trump's tariffs. The economies of Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, are currently set up to take these businesses on. Why is it that Africa is unable to follow suit? Africa has a similar population to China, therefore production costs will undoubtedly be lower there. African authorities should keep an eye out for these businesses and welcome them in rather than searching for low-cost mineral deals. However, there is a problem. African nations must present themselves as competitive options for international supply chains in order for major corporations to establish tier plants. Low labor costs, a wealth of natural resources, and growing trade integration through free trade on the African continent are all advantages for Africa. Foreign investors, meanwhile, are hesitant to establish factories. Weak industrial capacity, inconsistent policies, and holes in the infrastructure are some of the causes. Africa must thus move quickly to avoid losing this once-in-a-generation chance to develop into a manufacturing hub for multinational corporations seeking to avoid trade disputes and growing tariffs abroad. In actuality, if Africa's major shortcomings are addressed, it may be able to integrate into global supply chains thanks to a number of structural benefits. First, there is a significant opportunity due to its young workforce. Africa will have more than 1 billion people of working age by 2050, which makes it a prime location for labor-intensive industries. However, this demographic advantage won't result in financial rewards unless significant investments are made in technical skills and vocational training. Or AGOA, many African nations already have duty-free access to the United States. If African leaders carefully craft trade agreements that encourage industrialization, the continent may draw substantial investment in sectors such as light manufacturing, agribusiness, and energy. However, if Africa doesn't take serious action, it could be marginalized. African businesses may find it more difficult to enter into Western markets if protectionism in the US and the EU results in more restrictive trade laws overall. Furthermore, African countries will continue to miss out on high-value manufacturing opportunities brought about by shifting global supply chains if they do not expand beyond exporting raw resources. African nations must focus on 4 crucial areas in order to prevent all of this. They must first develop their infrastructure aggressively. Congested ports, unstable electricity, and high logistical costs continue to be significant obstacles to Africa's industrial competitiveness. The infrastructure required to enable large-scale manufacturing must be constructed by governments in collaboration with regional trade blocs, development banks, and foreign investors. Second, stability in regulations and policies is essential. African economies need to offer long-term industrial policies that hold up through political upheavals because investors want predictability. Excessive red tape, abrupt trade restrictions, and inconsistent regulations deter companies from choosing Africa as an industrial hub. Third, Africa needs to use AFCFTA to further regional integration. Due to persistently high trade barriers within Africa, many businesses find it simpler to import from China or Europe rather than sourcing from nearby African nations. Manufacturers could establish regional supply chains and lessen their reliance on unstable international markets if the African market were fully integrated. Fourth, labor productivity and skill development investments need to be prioritized. In the manufacturing sector, Africa cannot compete with South America or Southeast Asia unless its labor population is prepared for high-tech industrial positions. To make sure Africa is prepared for the industries of the future, technical education, vocational training, and digital skills programs must be expanded. Lastly, governments and the corporate sector need to reconsider Africa's place in vital supply chains, especially in the manufacturing of electronics, pharmaceuticals, automobiles, and agribusiness. Africa has to draw in investments that create domestic processing businesses, so that more value is retained on the continent rather than just exporting raw materials. Africa cannot afford to be a passive participant in the changing global economy. Trump's tariffs and America's push for economic nationalism will shift global trade flows, and if African leaders act wisely, they might position the continent as an alternative production base for sectors escaping trade battles. However, this window of opportunity won't last indefinitely. Africa will continue to export basic materials while other regions, like Southeast Asia and Latin America, profit from high-value industry. If it does not take significant action, Africa has the power to make the decision.